Hello and welcome to Recap, Per Capita's research and policy podcast where we examine inequality and unpack our latest work in our fight for a fairer Australia. We're coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, whose lands were never ceded, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. I'm your host, Emma Dawson, Executive Director of Per Capita, and this week I'm joined by Shirley Jackson from our Centre for New Industry, Matt Lloyd-Cape from our Centre for Equitable Housing, and senior economist Margaret MacKenzie, who's just got back from the lockup in Canberra. And that's why we're here today. We're not actually talking about our own work for once. We're going to unpack the 2023 federal budget. This is a bit of a post-mortem from your friends at Per Capita. Hi everyone, good to be here.
Hi Emma.
G'day.
Let's start, Marg. Let's give our listeners a bit of an insight to what budget lockup's actually like. I'm sure they've all heard the term lockup and thought it's a process of people being chained to their desks while they pore over papers. Is that?
Well, I have to say, to be absolutely honest, it's always pretty intense, and it was a bit like that in the past. But we actually had ideal and very pleasant circumstances this year, and lovely food for anyone who hasn't been at it. So we had a lovely time, and we had enough space to work in and so on, and it was in Parliament House. And there was a wide range of stakeholders there, and we were very, very closely scrutinised to make sure that there was no chance that we could digitally leak anything.
Well, it's good to hear. I mean, Per Capita's very happy to be back in the lockup. Over the last year or so, we were kicked out under the Morrison government, although from what you're telling me, it might not have been such a pleasant experience anyway. So
no, I'd say that was a lucky break, Emma.
You said that they used to keep you in the basement, is that right?
Well, one of them was in the basement at the Treasury, I think, one year. They've sort of shifted it around quite a bit.
So, of course, Margaret's come to Per Capita from the ACTU, so you're a budget veteran.
Well, a budget veteran, but in fact every budget is different. It was particularly different this year, so that made it a challenge to interpret quickly,
yes,
I have to say.
It's much easier to interpret pork barrelling, isn't it, than actual investment?
Well,
I'm allowed to do that. Look, let's get into it, because it was the first significant full-year federal Labor government we've seen in a long, long time, budget that we've seen in a long, long time. And while there are mixed reactions to it today, my personal view is that Treasurer Jim Chalmers and his team have done a pretty good job of addressing some fairly urgent pressures on households and small businesses because of inflation and the cost of living crisis, as they like to call it, when we're all getting squeezed, while at the same time not adding to that inflation. So obviously a lot of the focus has been on those immediate spending measures that will provide relief to households. But at the same time, they've still managed to do a bit of a nation building in there as well, haven't they, Shirl?
Absolutely. Like, thinking about it from an industry perspective, and obviously us at the Centre for New Industry is what we're very concerned about. I mean, this is a huge budget. Like, we already knew that there was going to be the $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund, which has targeted investment in a range of priority areas that go a long way to diversifying our economic base and making our economy better able to weather the storms of an uncertain economic future. But on top of that, we've had billions of dollars announced in the renewable space specifically, and like chief amongst that is what I would argue is absolutely a nation-building project, which is the National Net Zero Authority, something we've been campaigning on for a long time. I think
Absolutely.
We were first talking about it about 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Not only us, people like friend of Per Capita, Professor Ross Garno, our friends in the union movement have been pushing for this for a long time as well. So
yeah, but it was a big part of our reconstruction agenda, wasn't it?
Absolutely, so I'm very, very happy as someone who's been trying to advocate for that sort of mission-oriented approach to industrial development as advocated for by Professor Mariana Mazzucato, that we've had a government that's really listening in this space. We've had a number of really good conversations, but I'm really, really happy to see these big picture, big ticket items get announced in this budget.
Yeah, and a lot alongside that, a lot of support for reducing energy bills, for providing energy relief to households, price caps in the gas and electricity market.
Yeah, absolutely. And like it's that sort of thing that makes me really excited about this budget, because we're seeing a twofold approach to this economic management. We're seeing the big structural reforms that we know will have long-term benefits. So trying to increase our supply of renewable energies through, $4 billion specifically for renewables over the next term to transform us into a renewable energy superpower. We're seeing this management of the shift away from fossil fuel regions, so that we're making sure that there are going to be jobs for people in the new economy, and that there's going to be a skilled pipeline of work going into these critical new technologies. But at the same time, we're providing those short to medium term stopgaps that will ease people's cost of living. So we're seeing some really, really good rebates or incentives, about $500 for most people who are on concession cards, whether they're pensioners or
and $650 for small business.
That's right, $650 for small businesses, which is not at all a small sum, and it'll be a huge impact for some of those smaller businesses that have been struggling over the last couple of years. And we've also seen a lot of really interesting reforms for sort of the middle of the market, like people who might be looking to get induction cookers, people who are looking to get reverse cycle and try and get their energy efficiency rating up in their homes. We've seen some target investments for that. So it's a really good, wide-ranging approach to energy that I really love to see.
Yeah, and I think particularly important is the effort to actually bring those bills down at the source and ensure that by doing so it's not the same as a kind of cash handout to people.
That's
which
right.
is
This
much
is a
more inflationary, wouldn't
stop
it?
turn gap.
It's also been quite clever because while it's actually seeks to manage the bills for consumers, it hasn't given any particular encouragement towards non-renewable energy production, and that's quite a clever balancing act.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
it is. And there's a lot of clever balancing acts in this budget. While we're talking about the energy package, Matt, there's a package for social housing energy upgrades or renewable as well.
Yeah, so within the broader 1.6 billion energy saving plan, there's 300 million that is designated towards upgrading social housing. And that's things like double glazing and insulation and solar panels. The idea being that the energy costs of people in social housing, they're the most people on the lowest incomes in the country. If you can bring their energy costs down, then that's a significant impact there. And we were sort of playing around with some numbers earlier on. I think it's probably going to lead to, we've got 110,000 homes under the overall bill. And for social housing, I think it's probably going to be in the region of 30 to 40,000 homes that will be upgraded under this scheme as well.
Yeah, so not insignificant, and providing not just better infrastructure and upgrades for that public housing and social housing stock, but a reduction in long-term bills for social housing tenants as well.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Something like double glazing. You put it in once and it lasts for indefinitely. And it's something that as a migrant to Australia, I'm always like, oh my God, where's the double glazing?
I know, it's everywhere in England, right?
It's been the law for decades.
It has.
So anyway, it's nice to see that coming through here.
It is indeed. And we'll get on to some of those other cost of living measures in a moment, because that's obviously the most detailed part of the budget in many ways, and some amongst the most contentious. But there was a bit of a surprise announcement last night that I don't think any of the leaks had seen coming, which was the tripling of the bulk billing incentive for GPs.
Indeed.
Margaret, was that something you had expected to see, or was it a surprise when you found it in the budget papers?
No, it was a surprise. There weren't any prior announcements of that, were they?
Don't think so.
And it will actually present a relief to quite a significant proportion of the population. That was obviously an area that was crying out, and that will be a very popular move.
Yeah,
I think it's 11.6 million households.
That's right, 11.6 million eligible recipients for that, and it's targeted at concession card holders, all children under 16, which I think is really important. And combined with the changes to prescriptions that mean that you can now get 2 months' supply. They have stared down the pharmacy lobby on that one. That's going to be a significant saving for households. The sort of creeping attacks on Medicare, I'm sure this still isn't universally applied, and I think that's something we need to get to. But the ability to reduce those healthcare costs and take pressure off our hospital system by getting people back into their GP is actually a pretty significant change. Yeah?
And that kind of feeds into the impact on other areas like aged care.
Yeah.
And so on too. If that actually improves conditions under which aged care and so on can be delivered and improves health outcomes,
Yeah.
that's a very positive thing.
It is, and that brings me to the thing in the budget that I'm thrilled about. Well, there are a few things I'm thrilled about, but the $11.6 billion commitment for a 15% pay rise for aged care workers from the 1st of July. long
Absolutely.
Yeah,
overdue.
fantastic.
These are some of the lowest paid workers in our economy. 90% of them are women. Half of them are women from migrant, refugee and non-English speaking backgrounds. They do really, really important work. I've talked about this before. I was an aged care worker in my early 20s while I was at uni and afterwards. It is demanding work, it's rewarding work, but it's demanding work physically and emotionally. There is nothing unskilled about it, and they're actually providing a service that provides dignity and support to all of us. Hopefully we won't all need residential aged care, but at some point, if we're lucky enough to live long enough, we'll need care from someone. So it's a really great, I think, Labor initiative that builds on the pay rise that was given to community social, the Sachs Award back under the Gillard government. And I think it bodes well for a future of investment in the care economy.
And that would include aged care workers in the home too, I imagine. So
initially, I think it's residential aged care, but there will be packages around the My Home Care package down the track as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's really, it's the residential aged care sector where we're having so much trouble attracting staff. So this will be a really good outcome for those very important key workers.
That's right, and I'm really interested to see that there's also some support at the other end of the age spectrum, and a really interesting investment in childcare. So, in particular in the skills space, they've invested $72.4 million to support more childcare workers getting their bachelor's degrees and getting their master's degrees as well. So we're really looking to up the level of qualification and care, which will also have knock-on effects with wages. When people start getting more highly skilled, it becomes very hard to keep paying them the minimum wage when they've got a bachelor's, when they've got a master's.
Because these are educators, right?
That's right, and they're already doing the hard yards, and sometimes, it can be really frustrating when we talk in the skills space to say that, maybe people should go on and do university degrees when they're already skilled people that are taking care of our children. But trying to ensure some of those benchmarkings is always, like a good regulatory change to try and make sure that those workers are valued and paid the appropriate amount.
And of course, people have pointed out this likely means that down the track there'll be a similar call on the government to fund a pay rise for early childhood workers.
Hear.
And that's no bad thing. These
Absolutely.
are the jobs we should be investing in. They make a meaningful difference, not just to the people working in the system, but to the recipients of care, to their families, to the future of children, to our social cohesion and to our well-being. And if we've got a government that does care about measuring what matters, this is a very, very good indication that they're going to back it up. So
Absolutely.
good news there. Let's get on to some of these other cost of living measures as they've been called. There's obviously a lot of debate back and forth about this. The opposition is saying that the increase in income support payments is inflationary. The Greens are very angry that it doesn't go nearly far enough. I, as I have said all along, did not envy Jim Chalmers and Katie Gallagher on this front. But what they have come up with is a pretty tightly targeted package of support. The first thing I'm going to celebrate, and I'm going to call out Therese Edwards from the National Council of Single Mothers and Their Children, Dr. Anne Summers, who's done a lot of work on women fleeing family violence and linked that to poverty and homelessness, and of course Sam Mostyn and the team that was on the Women's Economic Security Committee, which is the reinstatement of the single parenting payment from when your youngest child turns 8 to 14. And forgive me if I get a bit emotional about this one. I was in the Parliament when that decision was, I was an advisor in the government when the decision to end the grandfathering of that policy, which was originally introduced by Howard, was passed by the Gillard government in 2012 and pushed tens of thousands of single parents, mainly mothers, onto JobSeeker. It was a dark day for the government, and it is a wonderful thing that has been reversed. Raising young children is work. You cannot leave a child aged 8 at home alone while you go to work or while you try to find work or while you try to retrain to get work. And so this support is really meaningful. It's about another $176 a fortnight for single parents, about 85% of whom are mothers. It will allow them to, combined with Commonwealth rent assistance increases, which for families is up to $30 a fortnight as well, combined with those changes to early childhood education and care and the increase of the rebate there, will, I think, allow a lot of single parents to start to rebuild their lives. And the other thing, of course, they've done is cancel the very punitive Parents Next program. And shout out to May Lamb on our team, who put a fantastic submission into that process, and it was quite influential on the government there, but also to activists like Ella Buckland and others who made that happen. I'm waffling on this one, but it's a really gratifying change.
And in addition, there's also the gender implications, not just for single parents, who of course are 90% women. It is also for other parents too. So the changes to paid parental leave provisions, coupled with the childcare improvements, will provide a fantastic incentive to Australian fathers and other parents who otherwise the incentives have worked against being engaged. So this will give them a chance to really step up to the plate.
Absolutely. As someone who, when my daughter was born, I was still working in warehousing. I was working a minimum wage job, and I was entitled to 2 weeks where I was allowed to be at home with my daughter before I was expected to. I know, and that's just an absolute. It was a policy failure, you know, like not allowing fathers to be more involved. And like there are obviously cultural conversations that need to happen generation to generation, you know. Matt and I, both of our kids are at the same school, so we talk about fatherhood quite a bit. They're in the same class at the same school, no less, so we've got a lot of shared experiences.
And that has lagged so much behind other countries
absolutely.
Who really have much more equitable provisions.
We're playing catch up on the gender front a lot.
We are.
That's right, and like there's that real chicken and egg scenario where people are like, oh, you know, like men aren't as likely to take the provisions as women, which is absolutely true. But at the same time, the more generous you make the provisions, the easier it is for more men to take it up. And we start to see, you know, like policy can lead cultural change in this space. And I wouldn't be surprised to see that happen here.
No, that's something that we've been pushing for a long time.
And another example is actually with the provisions that raise aged care pay increases, that will actually work in reducing the gender pay gap, and that will again encourage families to be more, people with children to be more equitable in their division of labour about children as well.
Absolutely. And while we're on this subject, of course, there are the changes to job seeker and youth allowance and related payments. Perhaps the most controversial part of the budget, of course, the Economic Inclusion Committee had asked for a significant and substantial increase across the board. The increase across the board was not substantial. It was $40 a fortnight. But still, obviously, the first time it's been increased in the budget for a very, very long time. At the same time, we've seen that much heralded leaked change with the reduction in the age at which you can access an additional payment once you've been out of the workforce for 9 months, from 60 to 55. Again, that will primarily benefit women who are caught in that late 50s age bracket where they're a long way from accessing what meagre super they might have, even further away from accessing the age pension, but much less likely to get back into the jobs market, even in the tight labour market that we have now, because a lot of the jobs that are now available are simply things that are not accessible for a lot of those older people. Still a long way to go on repairing our broken welfare state. Let's not mince words here. There's still going to be a lot of people suffering, and a lot of younger people in particular, that, as our colleague John Falzon said last night, we must ensure that we keep moving forward in this space, that we keep improving not just the safety net, but the entire infrastructure of how we support people who are out of work. Not only because we need to alleviate immediate pressures, but because young people need hope that there is going to be a better future, that if they work hard, they can build a good life, and that the community's got their back.
And that's the thing. I think we're all hoping that this is kind of a launch pad budget from which the trajectory takes off, and we see rolling improvements across the board. It's clear that, you know, Jim Chalmers had this balancing act to play, and he wasn't going to please everybody, or even most people necessarily. You know, there's going to be sniping from the left and the right, but this kind of steady as she goes approach, and then building from this, I think that's what we're seeing from him.
Yeah, that's right. And that's what I think is so interesting about this budget. We're all policy wonks in this room, so
Yeah.
we're obviously very concerned with the detail. We like to talk about like
And the
taper
how.
rates.
We like the
that's
how
right,
things
the
are done.
how. But if we can like just switch the frame, I think the thing that's most interesting about this budget, even though we'll have specific policy recommendations and things that maybe we would have done differently if we were the ones in charge of the Treasury, but politically this budget is very interesting because it has sort of taken the wind out of the two opposing campaigns that will no doubt try to be run at the next election, where something like the job seeker payment is a really interesting one, where, you know, the $40 a day, sure, we probably all would have preferred maybe a little bit more was added to that.
$40 a fortnight.
$40,
Yeah.
sorry, $40
If it
a
was
fortnight.
$40 a day, I
sorry.
think people would have been very happy.
interesting. Yeah, that's right.
That's what it
My
should be.
apologies. $40 a fortnight, which all of a sudden it's not, they can't say that there hasn't been a raise for 15 years. You know, now the conversation is, oh, well, that wasn't enough, it wasn't quite right, which is a much less effective campaign to run against the government. And on the other side, the more conservative approach, which would be, oh, you're throwing, you know, gasoline on the fire, you're flooding the inflation with more inflationary pressures. They can't say that either because it hasn't been this massive uptick all at once. So I think it's a very smart political budget in that space.
And it's important to note that the targeting has been deliberately done this way because A, of the cost of a huge rise, but B, the inflationary pressure that would bring. Look, but that's not to say that we don't want to see significant improvements to the way that we treat people that are marginalised in our economic system. Now, I think the targeting of single parents, and let's not forget there is about 55,000 single parents that will benefit from this, but over 100,000 kids, right? That's significant.
And through time, it's more.
And through time, it will grow. It will be more. And there are, you know, significant boosts for those older job seekers that are trapped out of the labour market.
So that's around 225,000.
That's right. That's
job seekers over
that's
55.
a significant. No, it's actually the biggest single group of job seekers is those over 40, between 45 and 54. The second one is the over 55s, I think. And then there's Commonwealth Rent Assistance, which this is, Matt, I'm going to get you to jump in here as our housing expert. But the Commonwealth Rent Assistance has gone up by 15%. Now, homelessness advocates have been advocating for something closer to 50, but it is the first rise in the maximum rate in 30 years.
Yeah, and I think just to put it into perspective, so that's, you know, around $30 increase per fortnight on the maximum rate, which is around $185. We know that rents are rising fast. We have something approaching a rental crisis in the country. It's interesting when you look at the data. So the average rental increases in prices is around 5% as of March this year in the CPI. Obviously, that is spread across people that are having no increase and those that are having enormous increases. So we've got, like, our colleague here at Per Capita had an 80% rental increase sent to him a couple of weeks ago. So we know that, you know, for someone that's having no rental increase at all, then this is a welcome increase. For those that have had an 80% rental charge increase, then this one won't go nearly far enough to covering that change. So obviously, it doesn't cover everyone equally.
And it only goes to people on very low and fixed incomes as well. It's not going to help, you know, middle income earners in the private rental market right now.
Well, that's right. Yeah, it's very much targeted towards the people at the bottom of
But
the
again,
income.
less likely to be inflationary that way.
Exactly, and you know, and from what I've seen of the research, you know, increasing Commonwealth Rent Assistance. Okay, let's take a step back actually. So Commonwealth Rent Assistance, you know, it's from our perspective in Per Capita, it's not the ideal solution. You know,
we don't love it as a long-term policy.
It's not a long-term solution, you know, and we've seen it creep up from, you know, when it first came in, it was around $1 billion, and now we're up, last year we're up to $5 billion, and now we're looking at heading towards $7.5 billion by the end of this forward estimate. So clearly we're spending a lot of money on this. Personally, I'd much rather see this money invested in social and affordable housing, but we can't just immediately stop CRA payments and, take up public housing.
I think we're all on the same page here. Long-term CRA is something that throws a lot of public money at marginal improvements on affordability that ultimately goes to landlords, whether they're community housing landlords or private landlords.
Yeah.
But in a rental crisis, it's the fastest way to get money to households, right? And so as such, I think it's welcome right now. But longer term, Matt, we want to see big, bold investment in housing construction, in housing affordability across the board. There were some nods to that in this package, although most of Labor's housing policies were pre-budget, weren't they?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because a lot of the housing policies are already tied up in existing processes. So we've got the review of the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement in August. We are hoping that will lead to something that is more akin to the old Commonwealth state housing agreements of old, where we actually saw a decent federal and state agreement on building decent publicly owned homes for those in need, and treating it more of as, I suppose, more of a infrastructure investment rather than just housing people. It was seen as like part of the economy, something that was fundamental to improving the overall well-being and the economy of the country. So we've seen improvements in the build-to-rent taxation treatment. So this is the idea behind this is that we're trying to encourage more institutional investors to build and then long-term rent out apartments. So this is what the super funds and the government are talking about in the housing accord. So what this does is sort of lay the foundations, I think, for greater uptake of this scheme down the track. We're hoping that we're going to see some more improvements coming out of the housing accord and more investment in social and affordable housing from our super funds and other institutional investors.
Yeah, but housing really is shaping up as a point of contention between the government and the Greens on the left. So there's going to be, I think, quite a lot of politics being played with an issue that should be, in my view, well beyond politics. Housing is a pretty fundamental human need, right?
Well, the other thing about this budget, including housing, is that it will show up where the improvements need to be made or the corrections need to be made, because ordinary people will respond to this budget. Some of them will benefit quite a lot, and so they may realise that the political process can bring about improvements, and therefore it is worth taking action on that front to favour whatever improvements they want. In other words, it's revealing a democratic process. We can hope for that with housing too.
And it's great that we've got a government, right, that wants to talk about housing, that wants to invest in housing, and that recognises, unlike previous governments, that it's not just a state and territory responsibility, it's a national challenge, and the federal government is the government with the purse strings. Anthony Albanese's been pretty committed to action on public housing since I first asked him about it at a Per Capita event in late 2019. And we are now seeing some of those policies roll through, but the Centre for Equitable Housing, Matt and Lucy and Marg and the team here will continue to develop what we think are going to be the best policies for reversing the financialisation of the housing market here in Australia and returning housing to be what it should be, which is a home for people on which they can build a life. So work to be done in that space too. We're running out of time, but I want to come back to you, Shirl, in the last bit of our discussion around some of those other industry investments, particularly hydrogen. What's happening in that space?
Yeah, so there's $2 billion that they've set aside for funding hydrogen. There's been really big claims made in this space, particularly around Gladstone. They're really trying to set up a hub, and it's really going to help kickstart some more of the renewable manufacturing that we know we need to see in the country. But it's really exciting to see how all of these things interact together. So we're seeing targeted investments and targeted loans being made to different industries, across renewables, pharmaceuticals, medical manufacturing, all things that we've been calling for a long time. This is going to interact really well with the way that they are investing in the transmission. So there's another $20 billion which is being set aside for the grid, which isn't as sexy a part of the renewable story. Like, everyone loves to talk about, like, oh yeah, we can go and stand in front of a wind farm, we can go and stand in front of a solar.
None of it will work unless we upgrade the grid.
But that's right, and our grid is so behind the times, it is so out of date, it is so hard to work on for a lot of the workers that
It's an area where Australia really still suffers from the tyranny of distance.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so that's a recognition by this government that we need to address that and address it in a way that considers renewable approaches as well.
Absolutely.
And like you say, Shirl, it's not nearly as sexy or as cut through as standing up and saying no new coal and gas, right?
Yeah, that's right.
But it's the work that needs to be done.
Absolutely.
To get
And
us
they
to where
haven't
we
gone
need to be.
halfway on it. They're committing serious money there, and they're thinking about how it interacts across the electricity supply chain, so how that feeds into our new lithium batteries.
And in fact, any improvement to the grid also readdresses the need for batteries.
Yes.
So the need for
Absolutely.
battery advance is actually minimised by improving the qualities of the grid. We may as well take advantage of having different time zones in this big country to actually give us, to reduce the need for batteries. We get that through a grid. That's a very clever recognition.
Absolutely.
It is, and combined with the investment in community batteries and the support for electric vehicles, we
That's
can
right.
see really some important policy work being done here, the ground being laid for the necessary shifts that we've avoided investing in now for nearly 20 years.
That's right, absolutely. At the Centre for New Industry, we are absolutely chuffed, I can tell you that. It's a
And this
great
is a big
budget
one.
for
This
us.
is
Shirl's
a big
very
one.
happy.
Yeah.
I think one thing that's really interesting in this budget is just how something that we've been advocating for a long time is a full employment approach.
Yeah.
And what we've seen is the tax receipts that have led to this surplus. You know, a lot of the reason we have a surplus now is because of the higher income tax receipts that have come out of essentially full employment that we've not seen in the country for decades. Just to put it in perspective, you know, the most recent data point we have is something like 560,000 people were unemployed last year, and then the prior to the pandemic, the average was around 700,000 people unemployed. So what we can see here is that our approach to full employment, you know, you get people into their jobs, you get people working, and suddenly you have budget repair happening by itself. And that's something we want to see as things roll on.
Great point, Matt, and that's why we framed our policy approach over the last 5 years very much around that post-war reconstruction framework that rebuilt our economy after the Second World War through exactly that, a full employment approach. Really important to note, though, that while we do technically have full employment, which we, Matt and John Quiggin and I, in our submission to the employment white paper, you know, full employment in our view is where there are roughly the same number of people unemployed as there are vacancies in the labour market, and we're there right now. We're there,
Yeah.
more through chance and fortune and some good government policy over the last few months, and the outcome of the pandemic. But it's critical that we recommit to maintaining that,
Absolutely.
while recognising that if there is, as Ken Henry has said, if there remain so many people on unemployment support during effectively full employment, then those people clearly need more help than we're giving them. And that's why we're engaging so closely with the inquiry into Workforce Australia, and looking at what we can do to really fix a system that is completely broken and has become completely punitive and isn't helping those people that have challenges of getting into the labour market get what they need to get back to work, and doesn't adequately recognise that a big proportion of people currently on job seeker actually have a limited capacity to work anyway and should probably be on DSP or something like the old sickness benefit.
And there's also, we need to remember that there's also a fair proportion that are underemployed and would like to work more. So that suggests a misfit. So anything in this budget that's promoted training, which the TAFE part has, will also fix some of that underemployment that's in there as well, and all of that will promote productivity in Australia and Australia's growth. So in that sense, it's a growth budget.
It is, and it's a long term. It's a good short term response to the pressures we're under. You know, soaring inflation, real cost of living crisis, recovering from the pandemic, also years of neglect of the social infrastructure in our country and of the, you know, industrial infrastructure that's needed to grow. It's a very, very good start in my view, but there are still things that need to be done, and we'll be continuing to engage in the policy process around those things. Before we wind up, I want to give a particular shout out to Senator Katie Gallagher and her team in the Office for Women. This has been the best budget for women in a very, very long time, as well as all of those measures around Parents Next and increasing parenting payments, supporting older women who are out of the labour market. There's been another additional funding of almost $600 million on top of the $1.7 billion into women's safety, into the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children, and into supporting women and children from getting out of very dangerous situations. This is all, of course, linked to the welfare changes and to the Housing Australia Future Fund, which they're trying to get through the Senate, which would have a specific proportion of properties for people fleeing domestic and family violence. But it's no small thing to have, as the Minister for Women, the Minister for Finance, because it means that this gender lens is being applied at the very centre of the budget process. And as a long-standing advocate for that, that makes makes me very happy indeed. Look, we're going to leave it there. There's so much more we could talk about, and on future episodes we'll probably get into some of these more meaty policy issues in detail. We will continue to advocate for a fairer Australia, for an Australia that leaves no one behind, and particularly I think around housing and around education and employment opportunities, things that will restore the social mobility promise of Australia for younger generations and ensure that we recreate a country that is fairer, that is more equitable, and that promises a good future for all of us. So if you're further interested in the budget, we are having our annual now. It's become more than annual because there have been a lot of budgets lately. There's been 2 a year for the last couple of years. We're exhausted. But our regular federal budget analysis webinar with our friends at the Chifley Research Centre, the McKell Institute, and the John Curtin Research Centre. That's coming up on Friday, the 12th of May at 1 p.m. It's free, it's online. You can get tickets at humanitics.com, and our special guest is Dr. Andrew Lee, the no longer shadow, thank God, the Assistant Minister. Sorry, Andrew. The Assistant Minister for Treasury and Finance, and one of the best economic brains, not only in the government but in the country. So we're looking forward to that conversation too. So join us next time on Recap. Thank you for joining us today, and we will see you or hear you next time when we continue to examine inequality and work together towards a fairer Australia. This show is a production of Per Capita, the independent progressive think tank dedicated to fighting inequality in Australia, and we're committed to providing ad-free and editorially independent content too. We'd like to acknowledge that this podcast was recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, whose lands were never ceded, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present.